Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We live at a time when the strength of our fundamental governing institutions are being tested. Not because the institutions that have served us well have dramatically changed, or even because of external changes in technology and information. But what seems to be different is the leadership or lack of it of these institutions and the lack of accountability of their leaders. In the private sector, when corporations get into trouble, they replace the CEO. When sports teams repeatedly have a losing season, invariably they replace the coach. If sales are down, managers are replaced, all in real time. In politics, rhythms are determined by democracy, which means we should work even harder to get the leadership right the first time. But look where we are. We too often look at leadership today as about celebrity or attention. In a time when we've elected a reality show star as president, when celebrity politics seems the lifeblood of the American political class, it's hard to imagine a world-class politician or global leader emerging today. It makes you wonder, is there something in our culture that has become antithetical to leadership? Is there too much talk about grassroots leadership and not enough about the charismatic leadership that makes a difference? We see Ukraine President Zelensky in wartime, and we see that leadership qualities are indeed possible. So why the seeming dearth of inspired political leadership today? We're going to talk about this with my guest, David Gergen, who himself has devoted more than half his life to public service. He has seen leadership up close and personal. He served in the White House as an advisor to 4 presidents of both political parties, including Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. He recounted those experiences in his memoir, Eyewitness to Power, and later served as the editor of U.S. News and World Report. Most recently, he has served as a professor of public service and the founding director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School, and for more than 2 decades, he's been a senior political analyst for CNN. His newest work is Hearts Touched with Fire: How Great Leaders Are Made. It is my pleasure to welcome David Gergen here to the program. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Jeff, thank you. It sounds like I don't think I need to say anything. You've just captured so well where we are. And we can start right off with that, and you can just, you can mail it in from here on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One of the key things one thinks about whenever the subject of leadership comes up, and it is a bit of a cliche, but somehow relevant to this, whether leaders are born or whether they could be made. Certainly somebody can learn the skills of leadership, but that ability to truly lead and inspire, is that something people are born with, or can that be instilled as well, do you think?
Well, I think that there are some elements of leadership that do come at birth in your DNA. A person like Dwight Eisenhower, for example, he found out in his youth, just as Abraham Lincoln did, that when the young people gathered around and would follow their directions. But if you want to become a truly great leader, I don't think that's in your DNA. I think you really have to learn that through experience in the arena. You have to go through a school of hard knocks. You have to know who you are and be able to master your own temptations, your own your own sense of life and who you are in the world. That is something that's very much determined by how you sort of conduct yourself. And when you come up in crucible moments in particular, what we know is that crucibles such as Franklin Roosevelt, who was a dandy most of his early life, ran for vice president at 39, was a rising star, but still was seen as too lightweight to be president. But then he was struck down by polio. And for 7 years, he tried to learn how to walk, and he never could. He had to fake it in all of his public appearances, which he did successfully. But he came through that crucible experience strengthened. He had inner strength that came from fighting off and trying to, get back in the game again. And that's what often happens, that people come through really hard times, but they come out with stronger moral purpose, and that makes them better leaders. So I think leaders are self-made in many ways, and it much depends on them. It's not, people can't teach you that. You can't learn all you need to know about leadership by taking a course on it. You can't learn it by just sort of having people give you lectures. You've really got to go out and experience it yourself, and then become reflective. Wind in, interweave what you learn from books and lectures and so forth, but have the experiences in the arena.
Some of it, though, does seem like it's instinctual. You know, you see somebody like Zelensky, for example, and Reagan. I mean, those two are sort of bookends of a particular kind of leadership that have this sense of just being in touch with the public.
I could totally agree. They were both engaged. Both came out of the entertainment world, you know, and that's where Zelensky made his name. That's where Reagan first made his name. And it was a good thing that Reagan was only a Class B actor, because he then had to make a living. He had to hit the road and speak all over the country for a number of years for General Electric, and he developed his voice as he did that. He was out speaking to, as I say, to audiences everywhere. He got a lot of feedback. He kept on changing. So by the time, you know, when he was ready to go into the spotlight, he was deeply engaged with the ideas of his time and with the people of his time, so that Reagan could speak naturally to them about the lives they were leading. That was true. That was true, as you say, of Lincoln. It was true of FDR. You know, frankly, Barack Obama had a lot of that in him. And he got off to I think he's going to be remembered as one of our favorite. I doubt he'll be remembered as one of our best, but he will be remembered as one of our favorites.
There's also the sense you talk about to be a leader, to be an effective leader, you have to sort of be able to lead yourself. And yet, I think about that in the context of Clinton, who you obviously have worked for and know well, who was so undisciplined in so many ways, and yet was effective as a leader.
Clinton had done one thing as he was growing up, and you know he was indiscreet in a lot of different ways. He was out there. He was extremely charismatic figure, and men as well as women were really taken by him. But you know, one of the things, Jeff, that he had learned to do so well was he'd learned to walk on the edge, right on the edge of the envelope, a lot, because if he fell off, as he sometimes did, he could usually talk his way back on. He was very, very good at spinning out a yarn, but when he got on the Monica stuff, it fell apart on him, and he paid a price for it. I think he's paid too heavy a price, frankly, in people's memories. I think he was a better president than some people will give him credit for. But he was very good at that too, and some people know how to dance their way through things. They're just better at it.
One of the things, I'm out here in California, and one of the things certainly we see in Silicon Valley, for example, with startups, is many people that are great at starting a company, at being charismatic leaders and building a company, are terrible when it comes to running those companies. In many ways, Washington feels the same way, and that many people that are good at projecting charismatic leadership, at getting themselves elected, are not necessarily the best at governing.
I couldn't agree more. There's so many people who are, have the qualities to be in the Senate, for example. And I think one of the conventional wisdom in Washington today is that Joe Biden, for all his many strengths, and he's a man of great empathy, he's a man of honesty. I think, if you judge him on his human qualities, I think he ranks very high. But that he has surrounded himself with people who all come from basically the same place, and that is they worked on Senate staffs. They work for senators. And working for a senator is very different from working for a president. A president is an executive. A president is sort of someone gives orders and gets things done, is expected to get big things done. A senator is expected to get along, get along, and be part of some larger thing. And so you're not in an executive position. And I think the staff, it's a shortcoming on the staff that Biden has, that they're used to sort of managing things but not getting big things done.
One of the other qualities that you talk about that's important to leadership, and I really want to explore this because I think it's so important, is this importance of having a sense of humor, something that feels like we've lost so much of today.
Absolutely. Lincoln made humor in the presidency a really important asset for him. But he made it clear the reason he wanted to laugh so much was because if he didn't laugh, he would have to cry at what he was seeing. And you have to take sort of an ironic view of life. And our best presidents, the ones that are most memorable, are ones who can laugh at themselves. They can laugh at the world. They can sort of find, ironic twists in it. And, I'll give you a quick story. Jack Kennedy as president. Pierre Salinger, whom I got to know pretty well along the way, was his press secretary. One morning, 11 o'clock, Pierre's phone rings. He picks it up. It's the president. Kennedy says, "Pierre, come in here. I need to talk to you." Walks in. "Pierre, I know you love a good cigar just as much as I do." "Yes, sir, Mr. President." "Well, Pierre, I've got a request to make." "What's that, Mr. President?" "Pierre, I need you to get me some of Havana's finest cigars." "Mr. President, that's going to be hard to do. How many do you need and how soon?" "I need 1,000, and I need them by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Mr. President, that's going to be almost impossible." "Pierre, you're a good man. See you later." 11 o'clock next day, phone rings. "Pierre, come in here." Walks in. "Pierre, you get those cigars?" "Yes, sir, Mr. President. I got all 1,000 Havana's finest." "I knew you're a good man, Pierre. See you later." Noon sharp, the President of the United States goes on television to declare a trade embargo against Cuba. Yeah, that's a man with a sense of humor. He had a real sense of irony. We used to play in the Reagan days. We used to play a lot of pranks. There, you always had, you never know which way they're coming. But Mike Deaver and I enjoyed playing pranks on Jim Baker, who was chief of staff, and Baker always laughed. He had a good sense of humor.
To what extent are great leaders made, and you touched on this in talking about the Crucible earlier, great leaders really made by circumstance?
Well, it certainly, the context certainly makes a difference. You take, my friend Joe Nye makes the argument, he was former dean of the county school, makes the argument that in 1939, Winston Churchill was washed up. People thought they'd never hear from him again. He was seen as impulsive, a little bit of a wild man. He was stuck on how awful the Nazis were. He was going to get us get the British into war. And he said, "We got to arm," and they said no. So he was ignored and seemed to be banished for life. But then along comes Hitler marching across Europe, and suddenly the context changes, and the British people need somebody who is as strong and as tough as Churchill, and he gets hauled in, out of the wilderness, and he comes in, and he's one of the best leaders in history, but he needed that context to do that. Teddy Roosevelt often regretted that he was not president during the Civil War, because he knew if he had been president, he would have been one of our most memorable presidents. And he would be up there on Mount Rushmore 2 or 3 times. But Teddy was sort of like, I didn't, I lived in a different time. He sort of had to invent his own excitement, which he did quite well. But Jeff, let me go back to something you said earlier, if I might, because I think it's so important. And that is, you said, look, a baseball team's got a losing season, the manager, has to go. If you see that in films, you have a lot of busts in films. You got to go. You get displaced. And we don't do that in our politics. And you're right. We should be doing more of that, because what we've been facing now over recent years is a series of failures in our leadership. We're now getting crisis after crisis cascading down upon us, and we're not solving the problem. Look at how far we've already wandered away from guns, with the whole question of Texas and what's going on in Buffalo and so forth. Just a few weeks ago, we were all set to pass major legislation. Now this thing is slipping away from us, and it's going to be yet another leadership failure. I personally think that it's time for the torch to pass to a new generation. That the people who are my generation, I'm sort of a very early baby boomer. I don't think we have lived up to the promise that we had in the 60s and 70s. I think we've been there and governed during a time of disappointments, and for which I think the baby boomers deserve. There are a lot of good baby boomers, or some interesting people, but I think they deserve some of. I think it's time for basically a new generation to come to the fore, a new generation that has fresh vision. It's not as bogged down by the poisonous arguments we have of today. They can present a new vision of what America is, a renewed vision of what America is, bring fresh vigor to it, and bring fresh charisma to it, and get us out of this hole. The next 5 or 6, 7 years are going to be very, very rough years. They could be worse than what we've already been through. But I do think that over the horizon, there's some real possibilities. There's fresh hope there in that new generation that I'd be happy to talk about. But I'm a short-term pessimist about America, but a long-term optimist. I do think in the long term we'll be much better off than we are today.
I want to talk about that new generation, and you see and talk to a lot of these young people there at the Kennedy School. There is the sense in talking to a lot of younger people about, one, their cynicism about politics, but the second part of that is the cynicism about leadership, this sense that somehow the great man theory of history or that charismatic leadership is not important. They've been indoctrinated, it seems, in this idea that all we need is grassroots activism and that leaders, strong leaders, don't matter. And I think that's part of the problem that we're facing as we look to this younger generation for leadership.
Well, that's an interesting and important thought. I do think that in the new generation there are some people who are not going to be good leaders. They have they're self-important, they're arrogant, they're elitist. They don't have the drive, the personal drive it takes to be a great leader. But I must say that I do think that that there are elements now of what's happening, the way leadership is being reshaped in the country, that it's true that a great man, we should not depend on men on white horses to rescue us. What we've discovered is we do need great men, but we also need a strong civic culture. We need an environment that a context in which leaders can lead. We need people who are going to, instead of tearing down new leaders, we help to build them up. And I think a lot of that leadership is going to come from the ground up. We're going to have two simultaneous things going on if we're lucky. And that is we have very, very good people at the top. We find the Zelenskys of the world. But the Zelensky can only perform well if there's a lot of support for him at the grassroots level. And he's done that extremely well. He's built up that grassroots. He talks to his people every night by TV. He's been a very engaging figure. He knows how to talk because of his background as an entertainer. He knows how to engage. But you look at Occupy Wall Street and now the Black Lives Matter in particular, I believe very strongly in that you've also got to have a strong up from the grassroots basis. And I think, we wouldn't be having the possibilities we have today were it not for young people taking to the streets. And we've had the largest demonstrations in our history now on civil rights, on guns, on LGBT rights, on so many different issues now. You see great numbers of women's, with the future of women, on abortion. You're going to see more about that in the months ahead. And I think that bubbling up of grassroots fervor will make it possible for new people to govern more effectively. What we're going through now is we're going through the tail end of an old generation, and we're about to embark on a new generation. If they can govern successfully, a new generation will pull ourselves out of this mess.
It does seem, though, that some of these grassroots efforts, whether it's Occupy, whether it's the Tea Party, whether it's Black Lives Matter, that part of the reason that these groups have in some ways faded is because they have lacked that singular charismatic leadership.
Well, Donald Trump began to come close to that, didn't he, for a while? I think that star has faded a lot here in recent months. But there was that moment when it appeared that Donald Trump was going to be sort of a smart George Wallace. I think now people see that's not the response. That's not the answer. We ought to be looking elsewhere. But there was a desire on the part of the country to find somebody new and different, very, very different from what we'd seen. And at first he seemed to, he built a significant following. I think he self-immolated to a considerable degree since then.
Does the diversity and pluralism of today make finding those leaders more difficult?
That's a really good question. Some of the best literature that's coming out now, Jeff, through there are a lot of scholars who are looking at what does it take to run a democracy. How do you preserve a democracy, keep it healthy, keep it vibrant and robust? And what are the challenges? What are the fundamental challenges to leadership in the country today? And one of the major points that various historians and analysts today are making that needs more attention is that multi-ethnic societies, when you have a lot of different backgrounds and there's no majority, there are a lot of minorities that they have a very hard time surviving as a democracy. that what really works for democracy, you need a lot of diversity, but it's helpful to have one group that is sort of like the bigger group, the sort of the reigning group, if you would. And what we're seeing a lot, and I think from the right, is this whole idea of replacement theory, and that is the people on the right, increasingly in sort of the Trumpites, believe that the great challenge of our time is they're going to be displaced by Mexicans coming across the border, by people coming up from Central America, by all these different groups that are growing up. And increasingly, a lot of whites feel like they're going to the bottom of the barrel, and they're going to be forced off the table. I don't believe that. I think the answer to this is not to give seats to new people and chase some old people off. It is to enlarge the table. Let more people be at the table, have more opportunity. We're not going to make it if 10% growth in women in the workforce means a 10% loss among men. And similarly, 10% growth in Latinos coming in, or even Asians coming in, is going to mean you're chased off the table. That is the recipe for an explosive future.
But of course, it's hard to find, as you said at the outset, it's hard to find the examples of democracies that have worked with that kind of pluralism.
Exactly right. It's very, very hard to find that, and that's why we haven't concluded the great American experiment. America's whole history has been one of experimentation, to being out in front of others and trying to develop, societies which are not only more harmonious, but also give you a great deal of freedom and, encourage self-development.
Talk about it from an electoral point of view and how we get people, to what extent leaders are necessary to get people re-engaged.
I would like to believe that somewhere out there, we're going to have some people emerge in the next 5 to 10 years that we don't know much about now, but will strike us as being, wow, well, we really, you remember how excited we were when Barack first got elected? And I remember being on the streets in Washington, D.C. and on this inaugural day, and the excitement, that just a sense of idealism that came from that my God, we as a country elected a black man as president. There was just a tremendous sense of, I'm proud to be an American because we're doing something other societies have never done before, never done successfully. We've elected someone who's like a black guy in a white society. And so I think that those moments are going to come again. If you talk to historians, will tell you, we've had existential threats to democracy before. It came early in the life of our republic. George Washington as commander, he lost the first 6 out of 8 battles that his side fought, that his men fought. He almost lost it. We almost lost the republic then, but we rallied. We came back. We formed we got a constitution. We did all those things and made ourselves very proud. We became a can-do nation. We got to the Civil War. We almost went over the edge with the Civil War. It was the bloodiest war in all of our history, but we did get through it. The Great Depression, nobody thought we could make that. We changed it. We showed the world it could be done. We were the leader out there. And the Second World War, there would have been no Allied victory had it not been for the U.S. joining the UK and others. It was a really important moment. So what the historians will tell you is, we've faced existential crisis at least 4 times. We've come through it all 4 times. We're stronger than a lot of people think. And I think that's still true. But it's also true that we know that in times of adversity, frequently in times of adversity, that's when great leaders start to emerge, because we're looking for people who can have the capacity, the Churchills and the Roosevelts and the others, to come forward. Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, all those people came forward. We had, if you go back to it, I think the great hope for me is that the people who the baby boomers leave the stage, a new generation comes on, and in that new generation, there are a lot of people who served in Afghanistan and Iraq. There are a lot of people who've been out there as activists. That they begin to emerge as a group favoring change and providing the political cover and moxie to would-be leaders to make a difference. Right now, one of the problems that people face in Washington is, if you get yourself too high up off the parapet, you're going to get shot down. There's such a natural tendency in Washington tear down anybody on the other side who looks promising. Just poison the environment, make it impossible for them to govern, and we'll get them the hell out of there, and we'll take over. That's a recipe for disaster for the country. If we keep doing that again and again and again, we have to change, not just to the leadership. We have to change the followership. Those of us who are followers have to have more guts to stand up for people who are good.
And finally, to your point about being a short-term pessimist and relative to what you're talking about now, do things have to get worse? Do we have to reach more of a crisis point for the things that you're talking about to emerge?
I don't think so. That's we could just wait for things to explode so much you can pick up all the broken pieces. But the danger of that, of course, is it becomes irreversible. And so what you want to do is begin introducing new blood into the system now. And it's going to take a while to build it up. But I'm very involved, spent a fair amount of time with a group called With Honor. It's a military group, and it's headed up by a guy who was a Marine, a fellow named Brian Barcott. And the whole idea is to identify people who are coming up, who've been in Afghanistan, in Iraq, to identify those people who might want to get into politics. To bring them along, to give them help, to give them mentorship, help them raise money, and help them get elected. To try to elect some of these veterans, they're going to be like the World War II generation. That generation, when I came to Washington, the World War II generation was running things. We had 7 presidents from John Kennedy through George H.W. Bush, all of whom during the war, all 7, both sides of the aisle, wore a military uniform in World War II. Just one, Jimmy Carter, was not in the fight because he was still a student at the Naval Academy when the war ended. But those 7 together, for all their faults, and they did have faults, major faults, but they left behind a nation that was the strongest since the days of ancient Rome. Economically, militarily, politically, culturally, we were on top. Then we turned this over to the country over to the baby boomers. And frankly, we've been unable to find the answers, as I was mentioning earlier. We need more people who remind us of the World War II generation, not just military people, but civilians who want to serve. That's why national service, a program of strong national service, it says, encourages every person between 18 and 24 to give a year back to the country, give a year back to their community and service. There are a lot of things you can do. If you can spend 2 years at it, even better. But you get a year off your tuition if you serve for a year. You get your debts, a year off your debts paid off if you give a year back to your community. I think if we get more people to serve, you're going to find, and there are already a lot of instances of this with Teach for America, with Year Up. There are just all sorts of organizations now which encourage young people to get into the fight, get into the arena. That's the purpose of the book that I've written, is to encourage young people to be there, to get in the arena and help us get out of this, because we can get out of it, but the hour is getting late.
David Gergen, the book is Hearts Touched with Fire, How Great Leaders Are Made. David, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Jeff, I thank you for being so well prepared. You ask great questions, and I'm really glad to be with you.
Thank you.